Today we are analyzing a manuscript that explores the spiritual laws of sowing and reaping, arguing that absolute obedience to God is the definitive path to escaping financial bondage and achieving divine prosperity.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So a key theme running through this material seems to be the absolute correlation between personal obedience and financial success. Let's look closely at the section discussing how believers are meant to operate entirely outside of the worldly financial system.
The manuscript powerfully establishes personal responsibility as a spiritual imperative, yet it overlooks the opportunity to address believers who are financially struggling despite demonstrating genuine, disciplined obedience.
Oh, that's an interesting point because, the text really doubles down on this absolute equation, right?
Right, exactly. The weakness here is that by presenting this absolute equation, where any financial failure or bondage is solely the fault of the individual's disobedience, rebellion, or lethargy, the material really risks alienating deeply committed readers.
Yeah, it kind of assumes that anyone suffering financially has just, chosen the world's way.
Precisely. It leaves a massive theological gap for readers who faithfully tithe and obey, but are suddenly blindsided by unprovoked external economic shocks.
Like sudden layoffs or huge medical emergencies, stuff like that?
Exactly. Think about the reader checking every single obedience box. If they get hit with a layoff, this text essentially tells them, well, you must have sinned or you wouldn't be broke.
Wow, yeah. That would be incredibly discouraging. It makes them question their faith when they haven't actually done anything wrong.
It really does. So the suggestion to fix this is to introduce a section that explicitly reconciles this divine law of prosperity with the reality of external trials.
Okay, how so?
Well, the author needs to show how spiritual laws sustain a believer through economic instability rather than claiming those laws just instantly erase the instability itself.
Right, because right now they use that $5 gasoline analogy to say God just provides cash during inflation.
Exactly. And as a concrete example, the author could actually reframe that exact $5 gasoline analogy. Instead of implying God dropped sudden cash from the sky to cover the hike, they could explain that God's provision might be divine wisdom on how to steward resources resiliently during that period.
Oh, I see. So it's about resilience, not just a magic check in the mail.
Right. Alternatively, the author could include a biblical example of someone who was entirely obedient but still faced a season of lack. They could focus on how their personal character development during that specific trial led to long-term economic prosperity.
Okay, I can see what you're going for here. But I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
Is there a risk that focusing too much on external economic trials might dilute the author's primary message of taking intense personal responsibility?
It's a valid concern.
Right, because it's almost like telling a marathon runner to focus on the wind resistance instead of their own stride. If you validate the wind too much, do you give them an excuse to stop running?
That's a really fascinating counterpoint. But, what are the potential limitations to ignoring the wind entirely, though?
Well, I guess if you ignore a headwind, you get super frustrated when your pace inevitably drops.
Exactly. Acknowledging the wind doesn't remove the responsibility of the stride. It actually transitions the reader from simple obedience into total commitment.
Because they know it's going to be hard, but they keep pushing anyway.
Right. It proves that spiritual laws override economic trends, even when those trends are intensely hostile. And it helps explain why believers feel fear during economic instability. They're looking at worldly systems for security instead of trusting their stride.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, building on that idea of the runner's stride, let's look at how the author addresses those who actually stumble.
Right, the internal hindrances?
Yeah, exactly. The material makes a strong case for personal discipline by identifying 3 hindrances: disobedience, rebellion, and lethargy.
Which are super common reasons people struggle with financial bondage.
Definitely. And the author uses these vivid examples, like noting that a stubbornly natured mule or a raven will obey God, while intelligent humans just actively rebel.
Yeah, and that brings us to the second big piece of feedback. The categorization of financial struggle as a direct byproduct of lethargy or rebellion carries a punitive tone that risks shutting down the readers most in need of encouragement.
Ah, the tone. Yeah, it is pretty intense.
It is. The weakness is that the language used to describe this internal struggle, like asking how stupid men can get compared to animals, or framing lethargy simply as a lazy desire to stay home and watch the Super Bowl, it completely lacks empathy for the realities of burnout.
I noticed that too. It assumes the reader's financial bondage stems from malicious defiance or sheer laziness.
Exactly, and when someone is genuinely struggling, that approach makes the author sound accusatory rather than guiding.
Right, it feels like they're just getting yelled at for being tired.
Exactly. So my suggestion here is to soften this prescriptive hammer by deliberately shifting the tone from a disciplinarian to a relatable mentor, exploring the underlying root causes of lethargy and rebellion.
Okay, I like that. How do we do that practically, though?
Well, let's look at concrete examples. Right now, the author highlights this extreme example of a maintenance worker who strapped a cassette player to his body and wrapped wires around his neck to constantly study the word while working.
Yeah, that was a wild image. Very intense dedication.
Super intense. But instead of solely highlighting that extreme, the author should contrast it with an example of someone who overcame spiritual exhaustion through small, manageable daily focus changes.
Oh, showing how daily focus creates lifestyle changes over time.
Exactly. They could literally frame lethargy as rebellion born of exhaustion, and then provide gentle steps to stop this internal struggle.
Rebellion born of exhaustion. Wow. Okay, so what I really like about this part is that it retains the author's push for discipline, but makes it way more accessible.
Right. It doesn't lower the bar, it just helps them reach it.
Exactly. I wonder, though, if the author's strict parent-child analogy where he tells his kids, it is not well with thee until thou doest right, is that integral to their distinct voice? Like, do we lose their identity if we soften it?
Yeah, it is clearly laid out for sure, but could the evidence also support a different conclusion? I mean, a strict parental tone works for establishing boundaries, but we have to prevent the reader from feeling hopelessly shamed.
Yeah, you don't want them just giving up.
Right. So, to balance it, the author should bring forward the grace of the father's open arms much earlier in the chapter. It balances the rigid demand for obedience with immediate divine support.
That's a great point. Sequence the emotions so they feel safe before they're challenged.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's shift to execution. As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that believers must transition from worldly financial systems to divine paths of freedom, and absolutely refuse to let the evening news dictate their faith.
Right. Escaping the world system.
But once the reader stops blaming the economy and they actually take personal responsibility, what is the next actionable step? Because it feels like something is missing there.
You've hit on the final piece of feedback. The text brilliantly contrasts worldly economic panic with divine peace, but it lacks the actionable practical steps necessary for the reader to apply these spiritual laws to their daily money management.
Yeah. The text heavily stresses the spiritual laws of sowing and reaping wealth and tells the reader why they must escape debt.
But the weakness is that it leaves a massive void regarding the how. Like telling a reader that God has $19.73 for a $19.72 loaf of bread, that is a very strong faith statement.
It's a great quote, honestly. If you don't teach them how to budget for the bread, it just sounds like magic.
Right. So the suggestion is to anchor the spiritual theology with concrete, modern stewardship principles that the reader can execute Monday morning to physically remove barriers to financial freedom.
Okay, so what are some concrete examples of those principles?
Well, since the author stresses knowing the word, they should detail a specific method for consistent biblical study geared specifically toward finances. Give them an actual reading plan.
Nice. And what about managing the actual money? How do they handle external pressure on their wallets?
The author could provide a practical framework, something like setting up a divine budget.
A divine budget. I like the sound of that.
Right. It's a structure that prioritizes the tithe first. The author emphasizes that giving is the essence of living, so a divine budget forces the reader to put that theology into mathematical practice. It totally contrasts worldly systems with biblical wealth.
Because the world says, pay your bills, then save, then give what's left.
Exactly. The divine budget flips it. Furthermore, they could provide a checklist on how to evaluate daily discretionary spending through the lens of those spiritual laws.
Oh, that's fantastic. It gives them actual boots-on-the-ground tactics to apply to their daily money management.
Yeah, it totally grounds the theology in everyday reality.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful critique. We explored the deep connection between obedience and financial prosperity, looking at how to balance absolute theological claims with real-world empathy and actionable steps.
Yep. To summarize the actionable suggestions really quickly. First, add nuance by addressing believers who are obedient but facing systematic economic trials. Second, shift the tone regarding rebellion and lethargy from accusatory to mentorship. And third, provide practical, daily money management steps to ground the spiritual laws of sowing and reaping.
Brilliant. We really want to thank the listener for their deep expertise in this source material. We warmly invite you to submit your revised work back in for future feedback once you've had a chance to apply these thoughts. Until next time,